Well, many of you, repeatedly in the last year or two, have sent us in emails after the appearance with me of Dr. Harriet Fraad. And because of the things you've said, which have been very welcome here and very warm indeed, we have decided to bring her back more often, basically to respond to the wonderful things you've said and your requests that we do so. So let me introduce with pleasure again Dr. Harriet Fraad. She is a mental health counselor and hypnotherapist in private practice in New York City. She speaks and writes about the impact of our economic system, capitalism, on the personal and emotional lives of the American people. So welcome again, Harriet. Glad to have you on the program.
I'm glad to be here.
Okay, I'm going to introduce the topic today. We've discussed it before today's program, but it requires a couple of minutes of American history. Starting in the 1970s, American businesses made a fundamental set of decisions. They did that in the name of profits and making more money. And the two fundamental things they did was to really accelerate automation, that is, replacing people in jobs with machines. And we all know what the key machine was in this process, the computer. It really became part of the production system in this country, in the factories, in the offices, in the stores, everywhere. And they replaced millions of jobs that used to be done by people that could now be done automatically by counting machines or what we call computers. The second thing that really killed a lot of jobs, besides automation, was the decision by the same companies to make more money by moving production out of the United States, where wages were relatively high, to other parts of the country where wages were much lower, particularly to Asia, places like China above all, but other Asian countries, but also elsewhere in the world, Latin America, Eastern Europe, and so on. If you put together these two movements since the 1970s, replacing people with computers and replacing American high-paid workers with foreign low-paid workers, including bringing immigrants into the country to do lower wage work than that jobs had been paid before to Native Americans, you end up with a fundamental change in the lives of millions of Americans, namely good jobs with security, with benefits, with good wages, which were held overwhelmingly by white American men, disappeared in huge numbers, leaving those white American men without the jobs, the incomes, the security that they had come to expect as their due as Americans. Enough money to sustain a family, often with a wife and children at home. All of that was taken away. It transformed the family. It transformed the relationship between men and women. Part of the reason being that at the same time women were moving out of the household, wanting to have an equal opportunity of jobs as men had had, the so-called women's liberation movement. Then there were women moving into the labor force because with the men's jobs no longer being well paid or secure, the American dream couldn't be achieved by a family unless women joined. It transformed life. And what we want to talk about today, and what we asked Dr. Fraad to talk about, is how did this play out in the intimate arena of people's lives, in the bedroom, in the household, in the relationship between men and women, and in that sense, in their self-image. So let me open it up and tell us how you think, based on your practice and your experience, how did this play out in the intimate lives of the American people?
It had enormous impact because as women left the household because they had to, and as men felt disempowered because they were denied the family wage, and just as a little parenthetical, minorities never got a family wage, and minority women have always been in the labor force. But the vast majority of people were white in the 70s. 87.5%, nothing like that now. And therefore, they got used to having full-time servants in their households, these males. Women who would do the domestic labor,
their wives,
cooking and cleaning. Yes, wives who would do the domestic labor, who do the child care, who would emotionally take care of them, who would create the connections with relatives and friends, inviting people to dinner, the social secretary function, the sexual partners, and who would readily serve them because they were dependent and they needed to serve them. So men were in this superior position. Well, with women having to work and then coming back to men who were angry at being unmanned by having their wives working and their salaries reduced and their opportunities reduced, men often, most often unfortunately, adjusted by wanting more services. The average
in the household.
In the household. More sexual services, more emotional services, and more domestic services and child care.
To sort of compensate them for what was happening to them in the workplace.
Right. And so that what happened is the result of the fact that, according to the statistics, the average unemployed man does less housework than his fully employed wife. In my own experience, I've had many clients who have left relationships because the man in the household was unemployed, and to recoup his masculinity demanded more and more of this tired, angry woman who
had a job outside,
who had a job outside, who no longer economically depended on him, and who was angry at the level of demand. And so that conflict happened in the household. That's just one example. But women who needed help and equality and who got demands for more subservient services were not pleased.
Does that have something to do then with the explosion of divorce and all of that?
Absolutely. In 1970s, divorce was 1 in 4 marriages. Now it's quite a bit more than 1 in 2. And the vast majority don't even bother getting married. Most, for the first time in U.S. history, most people between 18 and 34 in the U.S. aren't married. So it's a huge divorce rate among that minority who are actually married. And marriage is a luxury good that can be afforded only by the wealthy. Usually only by the wealthy who can afford to get some other woman or minority to be in there doing the cooking or going out to a restaurant or taking the takeout food and the cleaning and the laundry other than the wife.
Right.
So that the wife and husband who have the money can go on vacations and bond, can get family therapy, can have their kids in a good child care center and hire a nanny. But the vast number of Americans cannot do that. And it is women now who are rejecting marriage. The majority of divorces are initiated by women. Women are now the people who refuse marriage because they don't want to marry somebody without the financial stability that they can count on. And men's jobs are precarious. They're not the stable pensioned, to use your previous announcement, and benefited job that gave paid time off for vacations with the family, that gave an adequate wage so a woman could stay home and be a full-time domestic laborer.
Let me interrupt because it is so important as an economist, because it's such a wonderful illustration of how a decision driven by profit maximizing, corporations substituting the computer for people, moving production to cheap labor areas, can have social consequences that are staggering, but that never figured into the calculation. Had we taken into account, if we had an economic system that didn't allow decisions like that to be made, unless you took into account what it would mean to the larger society, many of those decisions would have been completely different. But they weren't. The people who made the decisions, the businesses, looking only at profit, didn't have to worry about because they had no responsibility and no expense in dealing with the disasters that you're describing flow from the decisions they made.
That's right, because profit doesn't look at collateral damage. And the damage to the status quo of family has been huge. The whole terrain of gender has changed, which is probably why people get so freaked about the bathroom. because what is expected of men, what is expected of women, have been turned around. And emotionally, this has been the greatest disaster for men, because men have traditionally, and still do, often tie their emotional, vulnerable lives to a sex partner who they trust. Women's primary emotional partners have always been other women and children and relatives. So when these marriages don't happen, or when they break up en masse, men are set adrift.
They lose the
emotional connection.
Right. Whereas the women have others.
The women have other supports.
Now I'm understanding better.
That's why in the brief month that I studied mass killings for 2 months, because there's plenty of them to study, and I found that all of them had either an unemployment, it's all the men, because it's all men who kill masses of people, they either had an unemployment experience or a rejection from a sex partner, or both. Even the man who shot everybody at the Orlando gay bar, he had a very unfortunate sex experience with another man and was driven mad. Men are in a terrible situation, blue-collar men. These are the ones who support Trump. They're desperate. They've been dethroned, and they don't have the kind of jobs or the emotional connections that they counted on that went with them.
To sustain them in this adjustment to what the corporations have done.
Adjustment to what corporate profit has inflicted on them. And women have not been in such a terrible space.
Why is that? Yeah, explain that.
The jobs that remained were harder to outsource and mechanize. Social service jobs. They were lower paid, but they were traditionally pink-collar jobs, women's jobs. And also the blue-collar males have thought it was quite unmasculine to get a higher education. So women are the vast majority in all higher education, not in engineering fields or math, but across the board. And the jobs that are decent now require a college degree. And that means that
more and more
men
women
are also disempowered. And at the same time, as the capitalists were decimating jobs for white males, women's liberation was happening, where women were encouraged to want the whole enchilada. Jobs, economic power, political power, domestic lives, lives with children, romantic lives, the whole thing, not to be shunted off into the household. And African Americans and other minorities were demanding recognition. So into this scarce labor pool came more contestants for jobs, minorities and women, which is why Trump blames them completely bizarrely, because he doesn't, in his wish to suck up and kick down, he wants to blame the more vulnerable people in society, the women and minorities, and not the corporations who exported white male jobs.
But you're explaining very well here, I think, how that happened. That by not explaining, by not having a public conversation about corporate decisions driven by profit and what they would do to the family, you left men, particularly white men particularly, adrift, at the same time as discriminated, subordinated people, non-whites, females, wanted a piece of the economy, and so it wasn't so surprising that the men could easily be focused in their anger and upset at what was happening to them, not to what was actually causing it, but actually to women and minorities who were competing for what was no longer available to them.
And they're encouraged by the right wing. What has happened is the whole sexual mores, gender mores have changed.
Tell us a little bit about that.
41% of children are born outside of a marriage, and that seems quite acceptable. It didn't used to be. 1. 2, people live together without being married and then leave each other. Acceptable. It's an accepted, continuous fact of life. Sex work is much more recognized now as valid work.
Tell us what you mean by sex work.
And this is what I mean. all kinds of either pornography. One of the things capitalists have done, which we ought to take note of, is in the crisis of disempowerment
For men,
they have a
substitute.
very powerful substitute that men can buy, which is highly profitable for them, even though it further destroys sexual connection, and that is pornography. In heterosexual pornography, women are humiliated. Not in homosexual pornography, but in heterosexual pornography, so that men can pay and companies can make money in the profitable sector of pornography.
Feeding, in a sense, this upset of white males that have been disempowered in the way you've described.
Right, and giving them a sexual empowerment
substitute almost, yeah.
and substitute, which is dangerous. It also has changed the terrain of children's idea of what sex is. In our puritanical culture, we don't have responsible, reliable sexual education. Therefore, the average child begins to watch porn at 11, and that is sex education, in which there's no emotional connection, no psychological mutuality, but just getting screwed. And women are supposed to enjoy this. So that it completely changes, so that middle school kids are sexting each other, sending pictures of their genitals during class. The whole thing sex has been divorced from connection and emotion, a disastrous thing. And part of the developments of sex work are that there's much more discussion of sex work as a reasonable way of making a living. A particular development, which is spreading like wildfire, particularly in the South, but all over. Even at NYU is very healthy, huge. No, I wouldn't say healthy, but huge. There is something called the sugar industry, where the sugar daddy, a wealthy man, buys access to a woman, and in addition, pays something on a regular basis. The most profitable site is Sugar Daddy University, where university women get wealthy men.
Yes,
students, graduate students, undergraduate students get wealthy men, women students, to pay for their tuition or their tuition room and board or any combination that they negotiate. And in return, they have to be accessible. Not all the contracts that they draw up together involve sex, but many do. They have to be available. And that.
So when the man comes to town, they go out on dinner.
Right, or if he's having a conference outside of town at the Republican convention, although there they had mainly male sex workers, or the Democratic convention, that they could import their sugar baby and look very smart by having a university good-looking woman from a university there meeting with their colleagues and adding them prestige. This is huge. It's huge at NYU. It's huge throughout the United States. And it is an acknowledged, not much touted in the brochure, obviously, but it's an acknowledged way, and one of the few ways for women without money to emerge with an education
without loads of
without debt. And that's how it's advertised on the website of Sugar Baby University.
So yet in another way, this is
how sex and capitalism
interact here.
Capitalism has transformed sex here.
You make a job you can't get a job without a degree. You can't get a degree unless you borrow a great deal of money. The system is set up like that. If you don't want to come out of college with a load of debt that changes your life, you are now given an opportunity to bargain sexuality, in a sense, and your intimate time,
emotional access. It is what is
as a way to avoid the debt that the system confronts you with.
Exactly, and it allows a man who can't really negotiate change gender terrain and treating a woman as an equal to have a contract which is not binding. Either party can break that contract, and in which he doesn't have to meet the new gender norms. He doesn't have to.
He doesn't have to give his own emotional
That's right.
access.
He doesn't have to give emotional access, or he can without worrying, because this is actually wealthy men feel better. When they give money, they feel they're getting their money's worth. They don't have to give anything else.
Right.
And I've found that with wealthy male clients of mine. they give their children money they feel they've given. What else is there to ask? Because they actually confuse their emotional selves with their money. And so it's reasonable that they do that. At any rate, the most popular job in the sex trades is the GFE, the girlfriend experience.
GFE.
Girlfriend experience,
Okay.
where you hire a woman for a day, a night, a week, 2 weeks to be your girlfriend, to take care of you, to be interested in you, to go where you're going, and to generally lavish on you the kind of services that a person would offer if she loved you. But of course, without the love and the voluntary choosing. This is a boon to many women who are afraid that if they got involved with a man emotionally and married him, they would lose their career possibilities. Because women who are married get less money and opportunities than women who are. Married men get more, but women get less. And mothers get even less. So that women get not only a debt-free education if they're sugar babies around that, but they also have a relationship in which they don't have to worry about losing their career focus, which becomes more and more urgent as nothing else is there for people. It's not like women can rely on men to support them. They can't. That's over for the mass of the American people. And so that you have masses of lonely people changing the whole sex terrain. What's expected, what's not expected. And
the whole is beyond sex. It's the whole
sexual relationship and relationship altogether
between men and women, and therefore by extension parents and children. All of this is being and I don't want to use this word loosely. It's revolutionized.
It is revolutionized because also
with no one taking responsibility.
That's right.
No one pointing the finger at the economic decisions that are crucial to this story. And so everybody trying to find a way to solve it on an intimate, personal level, which you can't do because the forces are too large, and it's producing misery.
They're confused and miserable. It wouldn't have had to be like this. I don't think the family wage with a subordinate woman and children and who are dependent on a wage-earning male who doesn't participate or get any of the joys in knowing and being with his children, I think that is not a good deal for either the man or the woman. We also had a women's movement which was in many ways hijacked. It was hijacked by the CIA and the FBI in the Great Wurlitzer operation, which has been written up. Gloria Steinem was a CIA agent. Anybody who wants to look up and Google Gloria Steinem CIA can see it, whose purpose was to make the women's liberation movement, which started out with a very strong class consciousness, a gender-only movement and eliminate class.
But how could it be? Tell us a little bit of how, in your mind, we could at least begin to think about an alternative way for us to organize.
I think it's really important, because had we not done that, men and women together could have worked together to have it all, to be able to work, to have good child care and after-school care and summer care for their children, to have paid vacations. The U.S. has the least paid vacation of any industrialized country.
In other words, to build the conditions
to change the family.
To have a very different emotional connection with one another.
An egalitarian family. And to some extent, that is what started happening in the Bernie Sanders campaign. Feminists like Madeleine Albright and Hillary Clinton criticized young women for working for Bernie and with Bernie instead of Hillary. And they said they did because they want friendship and connection with men. They want togetherness for everybody, gays, straights, everyone, together to have a connected, collective, egalitarian set of relationships. And that was a big reason that people joined, because it was a chance to see a vision of another world with free health care, free after-school and child care like they have in most of other developed countries.
But seeing these kinds of things that Bernie stood for and so forth as conditions to enable a different relationship.
Different kind of connection
than the one that has involved
men and women.
Right.
From the family wage for whites, in which women and children were dependent on a wage-earning male. Now, and the women's movement did not develop what are the lessons you get from caring for vulnerable life? What are our strengths? What do you get from being with children? What does it do for you? And to fight for the right that we all could do this together.
But the men themselves, instead of being always elsewhere
and having to work all the time,
could become part of this, because the conditions to enable them to learn those life lessons would have been in place.
That's right. So that, you know, one of the biggest complaints of men with salaried jobs, college education and up, is that they don't have enough time with their families.
Right.
Because the structure isn't there. The whole structure of our lives has changed. Suburbia was dependent on the dependent wife and children staying home and the male commuting to his job. Now the wife has to commute. The suburbs are impoverished, and it all because profit was better by exploiting people around the world, and the whole world was our labor pool, not just whites in the United States, and particularly reserving special jobs for white males. But the whole world is there to exploit, without ecological protections, without proper wages, without protections of any kind. Okay, fine.
So where do you think this is going, since we're running out of time as always? Where do you think this situation is going? What's the prospect for the American people,
the prospect,
given what you see on your proverbial psychological couch?
Well, what I see as the prospect is that either men and women have to join, as they did in the Sanders campaign, or they will be at odds, their connections will fray, men will be in particular distress, and as I said before, it's hardly a mystery, it's all men shooting people. That's a sign of distress. And that people will be chronically depressed and unhappy, and that those people selling to despair in pornography, in weapons sales, in all of the testosterone products that have gone through the roof, will be making money off of this disaster.
And not solving these people's problems.
And not at all interested in solving their problems.
I wish, as always, we had more time, and let's see what the response of our listeners and viewers is.
I hope so.
And if it's good, we'll bring you back, as we probably will in any case. Thank you very much, Harriet Fraad, for being with us. I hope this has been as interesting to all of you as it has been to me. Thank you all for listening. I want to thank truthout.org, that remarkable independent